Today I'm going to be showing you how to complete the Thread Honey Stitch Sampler. This is available as an embroidery kit on my site as well as a downloadable PDF pattern. If you get the PDF pattern, it'll give you all the instructions for how to transfer the design onto your fabric. If you buy the kit, it'll also include 4 embroidery floss skeins as well as 2 needles, and both PDF and embroidery kit will include the written instructions as well as the illustrated stitch guide. Jumping in, you want to take the first color of embroidery floss that you're going to work with and cut it about 6 to 8 inches. It's a length that is manageable, that won't start tangling on you. After that's cut, you're going to divide your embroidery floss in half. So taking the 6 strands, you're going to be working with 2 sets of 3 strands each. Working with one of those sets, you'll take your 3 strands, thread your needle on one side and make a knot on the other end of the thread. We'll start with the running stitch. With this, you're going to start pulling your needle from the back into the front. The knot will be at the back of the fabric. From there, you'll go 1 stitch length distance and put the thread back into the fabric. You'll go a stitch length distance again, pulling the needle from the back of the fabric to the front, taking your stitch and then pulling the needle from the front to the back. Over and over again, leaving spaces between your stitches. Next, we'll move on to the back stitch. So we'll begin by making 1 stitch starting from the back of the fabric, pulling the needle through to the front, going a stitch length distance, and then pulling the needle from the front into the back. From the back, we're going to go 1 stitch length distance and then pull the needle through to the front. Now working backwards, we're going to put our needle back into the fabric where the first stitch ended. So you do not want any gaps in this, you want a continuous line. With that second stitch done, again, we're going to repeat that, going a stitch length distance away from the back and pulling the needle into the front. Moving on to the star stitch or Algerian eye stitch, we're going to begin at the end of one of our start points and pull the needle through the center of the star. Moving on to the second point, we're going to pull our needle from the back and then put it back through that center. Working our way around the star, we want the needle to be going through that same center spot every time we pull it through the middle. Moving on to the chain stitch. This is technically going to be a reverse chain stitch. So we're going to begin by making 1 small stitch. After that stitch is created, we're going to pull our needle from the back to the front a stitch length distance. After the needle is in front of the fabric, we're going to slide the needle horizontally on top of the fabric underneath that first stitch. We'll then take our needle back from the front of the fabric into the back at that same point that we pulled it through. Repeating this process, you'll pull your needle from the back to the front, slide it underneath that last chain stitch you made, and then put it back through your original point that you created your last stitch. Moving on to the leaf stitch, we're going to be using the Cretan leaf stitch technique. We'll begin by creating 1 small stitch down the length of the leaf, about 1/4 or 1/5 of the way down. With your needle at the back of the hoop again, you're going to create a stitch directly to the right of the first stitch. Where you'll place the needle is right past that original first stitch down the length of the leaf. Now going to the left side, again, we're going to pull the needle through and create a stitch that is just slightly longer than the last stitch we made. We'll work from the right to the left, always pulling down that center line. Your stitches will overlap one onto the other, and as you go on, it will start to create a leaf shape. If you want to play around with the different ways that this stitch technique can look, instead of doing a straight line down the center, you could always draw a little curved line, following that curve instead of the straight line coming down, it will create a different look to your leaf. Next, we'll work on the stem stitch. So you're going to start by making one small stitch, but you're going to keep that left hand holding onto the thread so it doesn't pull all the way through. With that thread being held, you're going to go halfway back on your stitch, and then you can pull it all the way through. So now we'll make another stitch, and this time we're going to come to the end of that first stitch we made and pull all the way through. So you're going to be using that left hand the entire time to hold that thread until you're ready to pull it all the way. Again, we'll go another stitch length, come back to the end of the previous stitch, and now we can pull the thread all the way through. Over time with the stem stitch, it'll start to look twisted. That's what gives the stitch this specific texture. We'll move on to the satin stitch. So you can start at one end or the other. For this shape, I'm going to actually start in the middle. I feel like that helps me because as we follow the contours of the moon, it's nice to kind of overlap the stitches. So starting at the middle will allow that to go a little bit easier. So as you can see, I'm pulling the thread from one side to the other on top of the fabric. So where you last put the needle into the fabric from the front to the back, you'll place the needle right next to it, coming from the back to the front. Now this can be a little tricky. Sometimes when you do that, you'll kind of see your stitch disappear if the needle was placed too closely. So if you ever have a hard time doing that, you can always come on the same side again. So from the back, you'll see a little stitch where you're kind of wrapping around as opposed to doing it one right next to the other, if that makes sense. Moving on to the French knot, you're going to start by holding your needle in one hand in the front of the hoop and then wrapping around that needle with your other hand. So you'll wrap the thread around the needle, I'd say 2 or 3 times. You can play around with how many times you wrap to get a bigger or smaller knot. So once you bring your needle from the back to the front, again, we're going to hold that needle with the right hand, wrap the thread around the needle 2 or 3 times, and place that needle very close to the hole that you came out of, but not the exact same one. So if you were to put your needle back into the same hole you just came out of, your French knot will kind of disappear and go poof and go missing. So you want to place that needle as close to that hole as possible, but not the exact hole. And then once you are through the fabric, you can let go and complete the knot. Moving on to the herringbone ladder stitch. It's actually a combination of 2 stitches. So first you're going to create your ladder rails by using the back stitch. And the length of these back stitches are going to be important because it will determine how loose or tight your herringbone ladder is. Once you have the back stitches complete, you can move on to creating the herringbone ladder. And this is a really good one to use the illustrated stitch techniques included in your instructions to see how you'll make this ladder. But you'll skip the first rung, we'll call it, of the back stitch, pull it through, and then loop around to that first rung. So once that's pulled through, again, we skipped that first rung or stitch and are pulling it back around. So we're kind of winding backwards around these stitches. Again, a really good one to use the illustration, but we're skipping a stitch and then pulling back around to create your herringbone ladder. And this ladder is all created on top of the fabric, so we're not going through until we make our end point. It's all being done on top, just like we did in the chain stitch. The final stitch will be the long and short stitch, and this is probably the loosey-gooseyest of the instructions. Depending on the shape that you're working with, it will depend on how you want to use this stitch. Because this is a sun and a really radial shape, I'm working outwards in. So first I'm using kind of a backstitch method to outline the shape. Once that is all outlined, I'm going to begin filling in, just using a combination of both longer and shorter stitches like the name suggests. So for this, I'm kind of following these starburst shapes, not worrying too much about the stitches being the exact same length, just starting to fill in until we meet towards the center. So with this, you could use your stitches going like the top down. Again, because this is such a radial shape, I decided to go more towards the middle. The long and short stitch is a great fill stitch, so you're more worried about just filling up the area than it being perfect. You're using a combination of long and short stitches to fill it up. And here is a look at the finished sampler. So this is great to reference for future embroidery projects. If you want to try to remember, oh, how did I do that one? You can always look at your sampler and say, okay, I'm going to use the running stitch for this project, or I'm going to try using the long and short stitch. Thanks for watching. Again, you can find the pattern and embroidery kit on my website at thethreadhoney.com. I also have links below. If you complete the sampler, these are also all 10 of the stitch techniques that I use in my book, Embroidery Now. So once you finish the stitch sampler, you can do any of the 30 projects available in my book. That's linked below as well. Happy stitching!